staff are women, so it was really hard to just pick on two of them. But today we're going to meet Emily Mills. You're based in London, I think, Emily, but our paths are very rarely crossed. So do you want to tell me what you do? What's your job title to start off with?
So I'm the project director for Space Agency's Space Surveillance and Tracking project, which is quite
So
a
that
mouthful.
sounds rather spectacular. It sounds very grand. What is it? I would just wonder if you're spying from space. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, surveillance sounds a bit sinister, doesn't it? It's not. We're actually spying the other way. So what we do is we use sensors, normally down here on Earth, to look up at satellites and debris which are orbiting us all of the time, and we use that to track where they are, to predict where they're going to be in the future, and most importantly, to predict whether there's any likelihood that they might collide with each other. And that lets us warn them so that they can then maneuver out of the way and hopefully we avoid a collision.
Okay, so how many bits are there floating in space?
Um, Absolutely loads is the short answer. So there's about 2,500 ish active satellites, but there's 25,000 pieces of debris, larger than about the size of a football. And there's 130 million pieces of debris out there orbiting the Earth, larger than about a millimeter wide. So there's a huge amount of stuff up there that we don't really think about.
So where has it all come from? Has it always been there, or have we put it up there?
This is all man-made. It's all man-made stuff. So often it's bits of old satellites. Sometimes just a satellite once it stops working. Sometimes they fragment, they essentially explode, and so it's all the bits from that. It's old bits of rockets that we've used to launch satellites. There's even a tool that is orbiting the Earth that was dropped by an astronaut from the International Space Station. But no, all of those pieces of debris are man-made.
God, that astronaut must have been so angry when he lost his screwdriver or spanner or whatever it was. You know what it's like when you're up a ladder and you drop something. Imagine you do it that in space. It's presumably that much worse when it hits something else. So what happens when it hits something?
So, I mean, each of those pieces of debris is orbiting the Earth at something like 7.5 kilometers a second. That's about 10
Wow.
times faster than a bullet from a gun. So they're going at insanely huge, like insanely fast. And if two of those things hit above, I don't know, about the size of an apple, something like that, they're going to explode. That can completely destroy a satellite. And that's not just going to destroy that satellite, stop the satellite from doing its mission, it's also going to create more pieces of debris, which could potentially be up in orbit for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. So it's it's a really bad day at work if that happens. And our real aim is to make sure that it doesn't happen at all.
So have any satellites collided with each other?
There is one major collision that we tend to look back on that was in 2009, where a US communication satellite collided with a defunct Russian satellite. And it was a massive collision. It was responsible for something like 2,000 pieces of debris.
Wow.
And it's really something that in the 12 years since, we really hold up as an example of what we absolutely don't want to happen, and of something that we're all working to avoid. And that really actually galvanized people around this huge international consensus that we cannot let this happen again, because it's far too damaging for our environment.
God, that's amazing. Now, while I think of it, if anybody watching would like to ask any questions, please do. There's a chat bar you can type your questions in, and I can ask Emily to answer any of your questions as we go along. So do that. So, with all these bits floating in space that might wreck your satellite, and of course, satellites cost a huge amount. So, what do you do about them?
Well, there's lots of things we can do. What we do in my team is we do space predator tracking. So while they're operating, we try and sort of day by day predict whether there's likely to be a collision, so that we can warn them
Mhm.
to maneuver out of the way. And that's something which a number of organisations and countries do around the world, and is generally fairly successful. Although it is very difficult to do, I should add. But we do lots of other things as well. So when we license a satellite in the UK, and other countries do the same, we make sure that their mission plan, what they're going to do, is done in a sort of safe and sustainable manner. We work with all of our international partners. So in the UN, we work in a forum called the Interagency Debris Committee. to make sure that we are creating guidelines for safe use of space and making sure that everyone knows what kind of good looks like, so we know what to aim for. And we're also doing lots of really, really cool stuff with technology to try and solve the problem. So we're looking at missions where you can actually go up into space and remove an old piece of debris from orbit and drag it back down into the Earth's atmosphere so it burns up, or drag it upwards so it's well out of the way of the orbits that we use. Um, all of that technology is really just being trialed at the moment. Plenty of it in the UK, plenty of it through stuff that the space agency is involved in. And that's a really exciting area that I think is going to become even cooler in the next few years when we start to see it happen in practice.
So, talk me through what happens. We've just got a question about what the average life expectancy of a satellite is. So, presumably, we launch a satellite, it goes into space, it then lasts a few years. But then what happens? Does it just stay there forever, or does it come back down, or what happens?
It's a really good question. I actually don't know the average life expectancy. It really depends on the type of mission. So in low Earth
Mm.
orbit, some of them might only be a few years. If you're up in geostationary orbit, which is a lot harder to get to and a lot more expensive to get to, you tend to want your satellite to stick around for quite a while, so it can be into the sort of over a decade. And what we do at the end of life, or what we definitely try and do, is we try and get those satellites out of where they're going to be an obstruction to other spacecraft. So we'll either, if they're right up in geostationary orbit, which is, oh, 37,000 kilometers ish above the Earth. I hope I haven't got that wrong. We push them even
That's
further
right.
up so that they go way out of where we need. And if they're in low Earth orbit, which is like a few hundred to about 1,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface, we bring them back down. And what happens is they start to get caught up in the Earth's atmosphere, the drag from the Earth's atmosphere. And so gradually they'll come closer and closer, and they'll basically burn up in the atmosphere on their way back in, as long as they haven't got anything particularly hard on board, which most modern satellites don't.
So I suppose that's why we're always having to push the space station up into a higher orbit, because the drag at that orbit, which is what 300 kilometers, 500 kilometers, something like that, isn't it?
Mm.
It's There's enough atmosphere for that to slow down, so it has to keep on working to get back into a higher orbit. But presumably that's a good thing, isn't it, for most of these satellites when they die?
Yes, exactly. So we almost have a natural cleanup process with the atmosphere, because as long as it's in the lower few hundred kilometers above the Earth's surface, that drag will just bring it back down. And most satellites nowadays are what's called designed for demise. So they're basically designed that they'll completely burn up. But if something really big re-enters, and we've had a couple over the last few years, parts of that will survive the process of re-entering the atmosphere. And there is a very, very small chance that those could impact down here on Earth. I should say no one's ever been hurt by falling space debris conking them on the head. It's only happened to one known person, and she was fine. But it does sometimes. We do sometimes see really quite exciting news reports of what people think might be alien spaceships or UFOs, and they're often bits of old satellites that have actually re-entered the atmosphere, and bits like the fuel tanks, things like that, have survived, and they look quite alien. They're these sort of metal spheres, and so people get quite excited. But yeah, they tend to be bits of old satellites that have come back in.
Right. I remember a few years ago when I think it was the cluster mission was launched and it exploded soon after launch. Okay, it didn't come back from orbit, it never got that far, but they retrieved a whole lot of distinctly damaged bits from the swamps of South America. And
Yeah.
on another occasion, I think some locals managed to find a large piece of rocket fairing that had our logo on it, which was very weird to see this being fished out of somewhere in the Amazon. But as you say, they very rarely seem to hit anybody, which is just as well. But I mean, what damage could they do if you had a very large piece of satellite survive re-entry and it landed in a, let's say, a populated area? Could it do a lot of damage? Do you think?
Yes, hypothetically, but it's worth saying the chances of that are really, really small. We've done quite a lot of work on trying to estimate, is this really a risk? Is this something which could actually affect us? And the answer is yes, but it's really unlikely. I mean, we're very helped by the fact that 70% of the Earth's surface is water, so chances are it's going to hit an ocean of some
Mhm.
kind. Most of the rest of the Earth's surface is uninhabited, so the chance of it actually hitting a populated area, and then not only hitting a populated area but hitting a person, are really, really tiny.
Yeah.
Um, but it could happen.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about the ones coming down and maybe re-entering and perhaps surviving, but you mentioned, I think, the graveyard orbit where you push satellites up out of the way. We've got a question here from Sam Tyrrell who wants to know how many satellites are in the graveyard orbit. Will they disappear over time?
That is another great question, and I don't actually know the answer. They won't disappear over time. There's no drag that far up. They'll remain there. The thing about the very high orbits is you've got quite a finite amount of space. So there's only so many satellites we can have up there, and therefore only so many you can put into a graveyard orbit.
Uh-huh.
So it's probably not where the biggest problem is, but it is true that they're gonna stay up there. The much bigger problem is in low Earth orbit because it sounds silly, but there's just more space in space at those sorts of heights.
Yeah.
And that's where you're going to get many, many more satellites, many, many more pieces of debris. And there's not really a limiting factor there. So
Uh-huh.
you can still keep accumulating satellites, accumulating debris if we don't do something about it. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that operators bring their satellites back down and burn them up after the end of their mission, or potentially put in place arrangements to allow them to be taken down if they fail, or potentially take out pieces of old debris. But it's definitely not something that there's sort of one simple answer. It's something where we need to really try every line of attack we can to make sure it doesn't become a bigger problem than it is.
So the space up there is huge. I mean, this is, I think, the thing that's quite hard to get your head around is that you mentioned the vast number of pieces, but they are an awful long way apart, aren't they? So, I've not actually done the sums in my head, but if we're talking about an altitude of 36,000 kilometers, 37,000, whatever it is, then there's a lot of space for quite a lot of satellites, even there, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I think what's really hard to picture and what took me quite a long time to get my head around is when something that far away and you're viewing most of the things from Earth. So, a satellite tends to know where it is. It'll have like a GPS receiver or something on board. But debris we can only see through telescopes or through radars or laser ranging systems down here on Earth. So we don't really know precisely where any of it is. There's quite a big error around where we think the position is.
Uh-huh.
So whereas on Earth, you might think something comes close together if it's within, I don't know, 10 meters. In space, we're quite worried at 10 kilometers because there's quite big errors around where we know these things are. And so we might think it's 10 kilometers away, and it might actually be an awful lot closer than that. So while there is a lot of space, we want things to stay well apart from each other. We're happy when they're a long way apart. When they start to get even relatively close together, we start to get quite twitchy.
And I suppose you haven't got very long to move out of the way because the speed they're moving, if you see it coming, it's probably too late to do anything about it by then, is it?
Well, no, that's our challenge. You've got to not only realize something could collide or could come very close together, you've got to do it in enough time to let that satellite maneuver. Otherwise, there's not much use in knowing.
Mhm.
So we try and predict these things 3 to 5 days in advance. So that gives someone enough time to maneuver, wait a bit, and maneuver back after the event's passed. But it's really difficult because the uncertainties only get bigger over time. So if you're trying to predict something 5 days out, I'm not going to say it's guesswork. It's absolutely not. We have an awful lot of physics and an incredibly talented analyst team who do this work, but it's much, much less certain than if
Mm.
you're looking sort of 6, 12 hours ahead.
So there's all these pieces up there, but how on earth do they actually spot them? I mean, what's the technique that's used for monitoring these things? You mentioned something about laser ranging. How does that work?
Laser ranging, you essentially shoot a laser up into the sky and you detect the signal that comes back, and anything that comes back has bounced off something. And it's a similar
Right.
concept with radar, but it's different types of detection. With a telescope, you're pretty much the same thing, but it's with light. So, um, I think a lot of if you take a photo of the night sky, you often get these white streaks across it, and those are satellites, and they just move much much faster than stars do, and hence you get a streak if you have open your exposure for a few seconds. And that's pretty much what we do to figure out where things are. We'll take that streak if we're using a telescope, for example, in low Earth orbit, uh, and if you know when it was taken and where the streak is, you can actually figure out where that satellite is. So it's really just using these methods to detect what's up there. The challenge then is figuring out where they're going to be 5 days from now, and that's much harder.
Right. And who does all this monitoring? Do we do it in Britain or is it done somewhere else?
Yeah, it's done all over the world. So the US do a huge amount of this. We do it in the UK. So we have a joint civil and military team of analysts who work out the Space Operations Centre in High Wycombe, and they are working all day, every day to take this data from telescopes and radars and laser ranging systems, to use some incredibly specialized software and analytical tools to process that, to do their predictions, to try and figure out if anything's going to come close together, and then to do some analysis around how certain that's going to be. And we then use that to warn people within government and in the future satellite operators that this event that we've predicted this event, and maybe they should take a closer look at it and consider manoeuvring.
So it's sort of like a service that you're providing, or is that yet to come where an operator can say, I want to be given advance warning if you think there's something coming my way?
So right now we provide that service within government. I'm really excited that in the future we'll be providing that to the commercial sector, so to satellite operators as well. But yeah, so at the moment we provide that to people within government, so the military, people who look at emergency response to sort of crises, to the people who regulate and license our satellites, and yeah, in the future to the satellite operators themselves.
And this must be completely international because, of course, satellites don't know anything about the different countries underneath them, do they? So are you collaborating with lots of other countries or is it all done through the United Nations?
Yeah, we work really closely with all sorts of different countries because, like you say, there's no point in having a single telescope in the UK because your satellite might not even ever pass over the UK. So it's a really collaborative international effort. It has to be, and I think it's one of the real strengths of the area actually. So we work really
Mhm.
closely with the US, with other partners in Five Eyes. So that's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, and us. That's five. I had to think of it there, and as well, European partners to take advantage of the fact that we cover the globe. And that we all have this shared interest in making sure there are no more collisions in space.
Mhm. I've got another great question here from Jodie. She wants to know if there are any missions currently in operational development which are designed to help clean up space. I've heard a little bit about some of this stuff, and it sounds amazing, the thought that you could actually do that. So, can you tell us what's going on in that area?
Yeah, there are. This is one of my favorite bits of the area because I think it's so fantastic. There's all sorts. There is a harpoon, there's a net, there's a magnet. People talk about a Hoover in space. And these are all just different concepts that people have come up with to try and pick up bits of debris in orbit and get them out of orbit. Um, there's all sorts going on. So the UK Space Agency funds lots of work through the European Space Agency, of which we're one of many members, including the Clear Space mission, which is going to go up and remove a piece of debris from orbit to demonstrate that it can be done. We also have the space debris removal firm Astroscale, based partly in the UK, and they actually operate their test satellite, their test debris removal satellite from Harwell in Oxfordshire. And we've also just announced funding for some national studies into the feasibility of actually having a national mission to remove debris from space as well. So this is a real focus area, and I think it's only going to get more exciting in the future. It's the sort of thing you very occasionally see as a headline in the news, and I think that's going to come more and more frequently.
This is sounding like a Bond film. I'm sure I remember one of those films where they did exactly this. The thing that got me just then was when you said Hoover in space. Now, I'm an engineer by training, and that's one thing I'm sure I remember is that there isn't any air in space, so you can't suck things up. I assume that's the media misinterpreting things, he said unkindly.
I think it's probably a very bad comparison. I don't actually know how that one works. I'm not sure that's one of the ones they're actually trialing. But the harpoon, I think it was Airbus trialed that about a year and a half
Yeah.
ago in
Yeah.
space, and they did a demonstrator where they could use a harpoon to pick up a piece of sort of fake debris that they were testing, and it was fantastic. It worked. It was so exciting.
Amazing. There's another question about whether there are any will there be any launches from the UK, and I'm intrigued to know whether you're involved in all that. So yes, there will be launches from the UK, but can we talk about the effect that'll have? Have you got to tell them what to do to make sure they don't leave a mess for the next person putting a launcher into space?
Yeah, launch isn't really my area, but there's loads of great work going on the space agency to actually get the first launches from mainland UK soil, which is so exciting. So we really deal with things when they're up there rather than while they're being launched. There are also lots of safety measures they take to make sure they don't hit debris on the way up, but that's done outside of what we do. We don't really tell satellite operators what to do, partly because we don't know everything. We don't have all the information in the world. And it's such a complicated decision that really satellite operators have to take that themselves. But what we do is we provide them with the best possible information and analysis that we can based on the best data we've got. And they use that with other sources of data as well to make that decision. And that's something which the Civil Aviation Authority, who regulate our satellites in the UK, they take a close interest in as well.
Great. Well, I think we need to talk a little bit about you because we're also interested in how people get to where they have come from. So you know what I mean. How they get here from wherever they came from. So tell me, what do you do when you're not at work? Do you have interests that are completely different?
I do, yeah. I don't sit at home looking at photos of satellites all day, although that would be quite fun as well. What do I do? I play tag rugby is probably my main hobby. I've actually got a bit of a
Wow.
dodgy wrist from a slightly dodgy tackle on Monday. But I find the absolute best way to forget about space at the end of a working day is to go and run around a muddy field with a bunch of people throwing and normally missing a ball. So I'm not very good at it, but that is my big de-stressor. And um, yeah, I've got a great group of mates I like to spend time with.
So did you used to play sports at school?
No, I was rubbish. I was really, really bad at sport. I still am, to be honest. But I think if you get a good enough team and people who you like spending time with, they will forgive you for all of the very bad passes and bad catches that I make, which is what I rely on.
So what did you do at school? What were you good at school?
Um, I loved science. I did a lot of science at school. I just found it so interesting. I love bio, especially I did biochemistry later on. I really liked sort of biology and learning how things work, how the body works, how humans work. Didn't like plants very much. I thought they were a bit boring. So I absolutely love science. And then I liked doing something a little bit more creative as well. So I made sure I had a slightly different A level as well, just to so I wasn't just looking at equations and stuff all day because I thought that'd be a bit much.
But don't you think science itself is really creative? I mean, that's sort of the whole point about it. I think people trying to put arts and science as two separate things when in fact they're very much part of the same world, don't you think?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think only more so as you get a bit further through the education system. I think there's a point where science is a little bit like just learning things from a book. And then you get to a point, hopefully, in sort of by the time you get to your A levels, and certainly by the time you get to university, where actually people don't have all the answers. And what you're doing is you're researching questions which are still unanswered. And that's where you get to be
Mhm.
really creative. You get to think about, okay, well, it could be this or it could be this. How do we maybe test that? How do we think about it differently? What other explanations could there be? And that's a bit of science I loved. It is when you really got to think, wow, nobody knows the answer to this. Maybe I could help get us sort of that much closer towards the answer.
So you did biochemistry at university, then what? Did you join the civil service after that, or did you do something else, or what happened next?
I did, yeah. I did biochemistry, and I did a master's degree, mostly as part of my sort of integrated degree. Mostly as an excuse to go and work in France for a bit in a lab there, because I'd always wanted to go and live abroad, which was really cool. And then, yeah, I joined the civil service via the graduate program. I worked in a few completely random jobs in the civil service through the program. I started doing flood resilience, so doing a big project to try and build a flood scheme in Oxford. I then went and worked on driverless cars for 6 months, which was probably the most fun thing I've done. except maybe space, but they're both pretty cool. And my big aim for that was I wanted a ride in a driverless car, and I got one by the end of my placement. So I was really chuffed with that.
Amazing. Yeah, there's a
And then
question
yeah,
coming. There's a question from Rosie, which is absolutely on the ball here. So, have you always been interested in space, or was this job a way for you to apply your skills?
I loved space when I was in school, especially primary school. I remember doing this project on space when I must have been year six. And I went and asked my teacher how black holes worked, and he tried to explain it to me, and I didn't understand any of it. I don't think I still understand how black holes work. Um, and then I think I sort of lost the interest a little bit for a while, or I sort of forgot about it, which was a real shame. I think maybe when you're a teenager, sometimes life gets a bit in the way. And then I saw a job pop up. I saw a job pop up in the space agency. And I thought that sounds really cool. And then I went and read all about it, and I thought that sounds even cooler. I've got to apply for this. And it was a little bit spur of the moment, and I'm so happy I did, because I've been here for 3.5 years working on pretty much the same subject. And I'm still so excited every day. This is so interesting, and I've never got bored of working with space debris.
Do you think you need to be very clever to work in space?
No, no, I think.
Look at
And what
us.
do you even mean by clever? You don't need to be an engineer. You don't need to be an astrophysicist. I'm certainly not. You just need to care about space. You just need to have an interest. That is it.
Mhm.
I work with people who went to university doing completely different things. I worked with people who didn't go to university at all. I worked with people who came into the space sector from all these different backgrounds. Very few of them were interested in space from the age of 5, and have just followed that career path ever since. Um, and I think we have a bit of an image of people in space as a sort of an engineer. No offense, Jeremy, who's really, really, really into rockets, and knows absolutely everything there is to know about astrophysics. And it's just not the case. Space isn't just about building satellites or building rockets, although that is a big part of it as well. It's also about coming up with the policy around space. So making sure that we have guidelines, and we work internationally to make sure we all agree how we should be using space. It's people who want to work on projects, who don't need to be a specialist in space. I'm certainly not, but who are organised or are good at
Mhm.
delivering things and can apply that to a space context. It's people with language skills who can go and talk to our international partners. I'm really, really passionate about the fact that this is something that anyone can get into. You don't need to be a specialist, and it's such a brilliant area to work in that I really want to see more people who maybe don't fit that very stereotypes geeky engineering role. Uh,
I'm going to ask you an awkward question now. What do you think is the most exciting thing coming up in space in the future, in your opinion?
oh, there's so much.
I
There's so
know.
much. Can I give lots of answers?
Oh, go
Because
on.
I should really say something to do with space debris, and I think it is. I think those active debris removal missions where we're going to go up and actually bring down debris to Earth are brilliant, and I think they're the future. I think it's really a bunch of countries coming together and realizing that actually we have to act a lot quicker on
Mhm.
pollution in space than perhaps we have on pollution on Earth. So I think that's fascinating, and the technology involved is so cool and so high tech. Um, but then I also think about the Rosalind Franklin rover, which is going to land on Mars and is going to bring us new insights into the building blocks of potentially what could be found there, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And then I also think about how space is being used to tackle climate change and to monitor deforestation and to predict flooding in some of the poorest countries in the world. And actually, I think maybe that's the most important thing, is how we can use space not just to explore the universe, but actually to solve some of the really big problems we have down here on Earth. So that wasn't one thing; that was lots of things. But I just think there's so much going on, and there's so much coming up in the near future.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's so much happening that it's very hard to pick one thing. And of course, different people find different things interesting. But do you have any advice for anybody who fancies coming and working in the space sector?
Uh, yes, get involved. Get involved. Don't, whatever you do, don't think it's not for you, because it is. It's for everyone. There are routes in through apprenticeships if you want to go and learn to build satellites. There are routes in through academia if you want to study, I don't know, orbital dynamics or planets or anything. There's routes in through project management, through policy, through languages. Find the opportunities that best fit your skill set and your interests, and then just go out there and talk to people, approach people on LinkedIn, look for mentors, look for guidance, look for organizations doing outreach. There's loads and loads of outreach going on to, schools and universities. Look for those opportunities, and whatever you do, just keep going for it. Keep believing in it, because it's such a brilliant place to work and it's such an exciting place to work.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I think we're probably just about out of time. So, if anybody watching wants to find out anything more, then we've got stuff on our website, the UK Space Agency. If you go to the button at the top right, then it'll take you to some of our materials, including things like careers in space, which is really handy if you're interested in that. Emily's just been talking about some of the most exciting reasons for getting involved in space are actually the applications of space on the ground. We're going to be talking about that on Friday. So join me again on Friday at 6 o'clock, when I'm going to be talking to another Emily from the Space Agency, Emily Gravestock, who's head of applications. And we're going to talk a little bit about what she does, why space is so useful to us here on the surface of the Earth, and find out how she got to be there. So join us then, and thank you for joining us today.